Hi and welcome to Knit for Brains. Today we're going to make these cozy lined mouse slippers. We're going to build a better mouse. It's very easy construction, easily scaled to a child or an adult size using just a couple of simple techniques, and we will have a pair of lined, super warm, super cozy mouse slippers for the favorite mouse lover in your family. Okay, let's get started. So using the first slipper I made, I'll talk a bit about the construction. He's got a stocking stitch body and a garter stitch sole, and then there's this little garter stitch border along where the opening of the slipper is, but it doesn't get continued here. This is just stocking stitch. So this is knit flat. I used US 4 3.5 millimeter needles, and I used a worsted weight yarn. You want it to be washable, so if you're using a superwash merino wool, or if you want to use an acrylic, a worsted weight acrylic, that's fine too, just so it can be easily washed and dried and without a hassle. The reason this is so easy to scale up is because no matter what size it is, you use the same knitting technique, and it's a really simple knitting technique. So for about 2/3 of the final length, we do this little garter stitch border. You decide how high you want your sides to be, so you cast on however many stitches you want for your sides, times 2 obviously, and then you cast on however many stitches you need for the width of your sole. If you want your sole to be 3 inches, if you want your sides to be 3 inches, it's really up to you. It doesn't change how we knit. The pattern stays the same, and then whatever your final length is, you knit roughly 2/3 with the garter stitch and 1/3 that final length for the face. It couldn't be simpler. So when you're casting on, just keep track of how many you're casting on, so that when you make the second slipper, how many rows you do to get to 2/3. Or if you like me, I tend to use a measuring tape, and I just measure rather than counting rows. I find that a bit tedious, so I just use a measuring tape. And if I'm at, this is about I think this is 2 inches to maybe 3 inches, and this is like 1.5 inch. I can't remember, and I don't have my measuring tape handy, but I do it by length, and it doesn't have to be exact. If you're a couple of rows short, it's not going to be the end of the world. And they've got this beautiful comfy stocking stitch lining that we will get to in just a minute, and that's just sewn in. It's knit just a bit short of the length, but otherwise it's the very same, except for it doesn't have the garter stitch sole. It's just got a nice stocking stitch sole on the inside. So here's mine ready to be tied off at the nose, but we don't sew it closed yet, and we don't pull it closed yet. And I'll just show you how it looks laying flat. You can see that this garter stitch makes it nice and sturdy and flat on the sides. It doesn't curl under like it wants to do when you're doing a stocking stitch. So that's my 2/3 of a length, and then the other third in just the straight stocking stitch without this garter edge. The first row is always knit straight across. Knit, knit, knit. It doesn't matter what part of whether you're on the first section or the second section, knit straight across when you have the right side facing. The back is where the action happens. For the first third, you knit 2, you purl for the remainder of however many stitches you put for your side. Then you knit across for how many stitches you put for your sole. And then you purl for your next side, knitting the last 2 stitches. So in my case, the sides are 8 stitches and the sole is 6 stitches. So I knit 2, purl 6, knit 6 for my sole, purl 6, and knit 2 for my second side. And I did that to 2/3 of the length of the slipper. And now another third of the length is just purl all the stitches for the side. So in my case, it's purl 8. You continue to knit 6 across for the sole, and then purl 8 for the second side all the way across, so that I don't have this. So when we sew his face together, it's pretty much invisible. We don't have that big ridgy edge that kept it so nice and sturdy for the body. So go ahead and cast on however many stitches you decide you need for your sides and for the width of your sole, and then go ahead and knit 2/3 of that length with this garter stitch, this 2-stitch garter border, and then knit your final third with just stocking stitch, garter sole, stocking stitch all the way across, and then meet up and we'll talk about closing off and doing the lining. Okay. So I am going to go ahead and do the lining or do the tying off now. I actually have to finish this back side because we want to start on the right side. So I'm going to purl 8 and knit 6 and purl 8, and then I will meet up with you when I've got that done. Okay, so what we want to do with the right side facing is just simply knit 2 together all the way across, and then we're going to pull our yarn through, but we're not going to pull it tight. We're going to just leave it for a few minutes while we get the lining done and sewn in. Okay, so I'm going to knit 2 together all the way across, and then I am going to cut my yarn, leaving enough to sew up the little seam here for however long, you know, your seam is, depending on the size of slippers you are making. And then I am just going to leave it flat for a moment while I do the lining. So just, if you just want to have some patience here while I get through this. I don't know why I'm fighting with this. If you did an even number for your sides and your sole, you'll wind up with no stitches on the needle. If you did an odd number for your sole, you'll have 1 stitch, so just knit it. So now I'm going to cut my yarn, leaving a good length for sewing, and I'm going to put it on the needle, and I'm going to take it underneath, starting from the back side, underneath all these. Because I use double-sided needles, I can actually just slide these stitches off as I go, which makes it easier for me. But if you're just using straight needles, just carefully weave your yarn under and take them off, or take them off from the front side if that's easier for you. I think that should work too. Just going to take these off. I'm using a sharp pointed needle because it's what I have on hand, but I would recommend a dull pointed needle if you have one. I have one, I just don't have it handy at the moment, so I'm using this sharp one, and I would prefer a dull one. So I'm pulling my yarn through, and now I'm just going to leave this flat, so it's got this loop that will eventually pull through. What the heck? See, I've snagged a little bit of the yarn because I used a sharp needle. Okay, so we're just going to leave this flat. And now we are going to cast on the same number of stitches as we did for the outside of the body, and we're going to continue with this 2-stitch garter ridge for the same amount of time, and then we're going to go into stocking stitch, but we're going to end a few rows short. So you can just, when you get it made, you can just lay it down and you can say, okay, I should stop here. Or if you've been counting your rows, you can know, but we want to stop a few rows short of the actual toe in the lining. But I do it the full size of the slipper. If you want, you can do it a couple of stitches less, but I found that it doesn't really make any difference. I did this one 4 stitches smaller than, so that I could stitch along the inside of this ridge, and it's nice, but it's still, you know, it doesn't make that much difference, but it's up to you. If you want your ridge to be just gray and you want to do your sewing fine, or if you want to do it like I did up here where it goes right up to both edges, you can do it that way too. So it's up to you whether you want to take off 4 stitches or do it full size. I'm doing this one full size. Okay, so I'll meet up with you when I've got my lining, and then basically we just sew it in. That's when we pull this and then start sewing the seams, and then we'll do the ears and the face. Okay. I just wanted to jump in and say a bit about the lining. I'm just working on mine now. You can see my garter edge and my stocking stitch. There's no garter sole, my stocking stitch. I just wanted to say to leave enough of a tail, because we're going to actually sew up the back of this white, even though we're sewing it flat to this to the body. When we fold it, we're just going to sort of tighten it up and sew it up as well, just to close any gap that there might be. And the other thing that I want to say is that when you get up to here and you finish, cast off really loosely, because you don't want it to pull and bind. You want lots of room, so do a super loose cast off, and then leave yourself a good length when you tie off. You're just going to cast off straight across. You're not knitting 2 together. You just cast off the entire amount that you cast on, and then leave a long amount, because you're going to sew all the way around when we sew this to the main body. Okay, so just continue on. You can see I've got my garter stitch edge here, and I'm going to stop, and then I'm going to go just to the straight stocking stitch with no garter stitch. So just continuing the stocking stitch all the way up. Okay, see you soon. Okay, so I'm just coming to, I've got a long enough length here that I'm going to cast off, and you can see that I followed up the ridge on the side, and then I moved into just straight stocking stitch, which is just knit all the way across, and then on the back side was just purl all the way across. So that's as much as I'm going to do for the lining. So now I'm going to cast off really loosely, like I'm holding my yarn, but my tension is going to be super loose. I'm just barely holding it. I'm just letting it be super loose, and then pulling one over. So I'm going to do that all the way across, and I'm going to leave a long tail so that I can, when I tie off, I'm going to leave a long amount so that I can use it to sew all the way around this when I finish this cast off. And I'm going to save this little tail, I'm going to save to sew up the inside seam. Okay, so I'll just meet up with you in 1 second, and we'll sew this together, but I just wanted to remind you to do a super loose cast off, just so loose, okay, because you don't want it tightening up, which casting off tends to do. Okay, see you in a minute. Okay, here I am on my last stitch, so I'm just going to pull my yarn through, and I'm going to give myself a fair amount to work with so I can sew all the way around. Then I'm going to cut. I will take this needle off. I'm still going to leave the gray unpulled. I'm going to leave it lying flat the way it is. Get rid of these. So we want to sew it using the purl bumps on the inside of the gray, because we don't want it to show through. We don't want our sewing to show through to the other side. So I'm just going to line this up with where it should go. That's the end there, and that's the end there. I'm starting about here, so that's fine. Actually, I'm a little bit long maybe, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew into these purl bumps. And again, if you have a blunt edge needle, you're probably better off, because you want to, I'm going to go through the back of this, the back loop on here, and I'm just going to go into these purl bumps on the gray. I hope you can see that all right. And so it doesn't show through. So I'm just going to go through the back, and I'm going to go into this purl bump here. Try not to get all balled up here. So I'm going to do that all the way around. I'm going to sew into the, I'm going to sew right up into the edge and right up to the edge here, and just sew it all in. As I said, I'd recommend using a blunt needle. Just make your life a lot easier. And I will meet up with you when I've got that part finished. Okay. Okay, so I've got my lining all sewn in. You can see, you can't see on this, on this side any of the sewing because I just sewed in the little purl bumps. And now I've threaded my needle, and we're going to pull the nose together now. Pull it together nice and tight, and we're actually going to sew this on the outside. We're not going to turn it inside out, because what we're going to do is the mattress stitch. So I'm going to go into one stitch here, the first stitch here on the inside stitch, like the inside of the two, right? Each stitch is two. I'm going on the inside, and then I go into the inside of the one right beside it and the inside of the next one up on the other side, and then I go right beside it and the inside of this one. And then I'm just going to, and again, if you're using a blunt pointed needle, you'll be doing yourself a favor here, because these sharp needles tend to catch fibers that you don't want it to catch. So do its neighbor and across, and then its neighbor and across. It doesn't have to be exact, you know, exactly one, but its neighbor and across, then its neighbor and across. And then we'll continue up till we get to this garter stitch edge here, and I will meet back up with you then. Okay. Okay, I've got my sewing done to this point. So what I am going to do is just tie in my ends, and then I'm going to sew the back seam the same way with my gray. I'm going to go across, and I'm going to do its neighbor and across its neighbor and across its neighbor all the way to the bottom. And then on the inside, I'm going to sort of turn it inside out, and I'm going to do the same with the white on the inside. Okay, so I will meet up with you in just a second, and we'll go through that. Okay, I've got my front sewn, and now I'm starting on the back. So I'm going to go on the outside stitches. So I'm just picking up the first one, going through, and now I'm going to go to its neighbor and across, and then to its neighbor and across, its neighbor and across, then I'm just going to hold it and pull that tight, and that's done. And I'm just going to bury in my edges, bury in my tail, and then on the inside I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to turn this inside out, just kind of push it inside out, get my needle threaded here, and then I'm going to pick up the first stitch on the top on the outside, and then I'm going to do its neighbor and across. Oops, sorry. Its neighbor, across, neighbor and across, doing the outside. And then I'm just going to pull that tight, and that's done. Okay, and then I'm going to sew in my ends, and we'll come back and we'll do the ears and the face. Okay, see you in a second. Okay, so I have the two pieces for the ears here. They're knit stocking stitch. You have the stocking stitch part at the back, and you sew your little stocking stitch insert. It's really hard to see, it's so small it doesn't really even matter which way you sew it, but you sew it to the pearl side of the ear and then sew them in. They're really easy to make. First you sew this on and then you sew it onto the mouse. So easy to make. The gray part is just, and you leave a tail so that you have enough to actually sew it onto the body, is just 6 stitches, and you do 4 rows, knit, purl, and then you knit 2 together, knit 2, knit 2 together, and then you purl those 4 stitches that you have, and then you come around and knit them and take them off the needles, cast them off. So I'll just do that quickly here. I'll speed this up, and you can just, I'm just going to knit this row, I'm going to purl the next row, I'm going to knit a row, purl, and then I'm going to come back and knit 2 together. So I'll meet up with you then. I'm going to just do these 4 rows of stocking stitch. So that row is knit, this row is purl, and then I'm going to repeat those 2 rows, okay? Okay, so I've knit my 4 rows of stocking stitch, and now I'm just going to knit 2 together. My yarn's kind of unfreeing here, so it's sort of messy. Knit 2 together, and then I'm going to knit the next 2. 1, 2, and then I'm going to knit 2 together. Now if you have a bigger mouse body, if you've got a, you know, a deep side that goes like 3 inches, you might want to make bigger ears, so just, you know, knit 8 or 7 or whatever you want for the width of the ear that you think matches best to the body size. Now I'm just going to purl these 4 that I have left on the needle. And then I'm going to cast off. And with my end that I have left over, this is where you get to sort of shape the ear a bit, because you want it to be round. Oh really? Do we have to go through here this now? Okay, here. Cast this off. You can see my yarn's kind of splitting up here. Okay, so I'm going to leave a little bit. I don't need much though, just enough to really get a needle on. You can see if I just left the ear like this, it would be kind of pointed. And I want it to be round for our mouse. So I'm going to go down back into, here's where I cast off across here. I'm going to go down back in there and down to this where I started here. And I'm just going to pull this kind of round-ish, rounder, let's say. And then I'm going to just weave in and snip this end off. I could have woven it in a bit more, but so there's the back, and then I'm going to make a pink one for this to go in. And the pink is really simple too. It is knit, cast on 5, and instead of knitting 4 rows of stocking stitch, you're just knitting 2. So you're going to knit 1 row and purl 1 row, and then you're going to knit 2 together, knit 1, knit 2 together, so you've got 3 stitches on the needle. Anyway, we'll just go ahead and do it, and then we're going to sew these onto the wrong side when we're done. Okay, so with the with the pink. Now, you know, your colors are unlimited here. These can be white, they can be black, they can be darker gray. Your linings can be pink or light blue. They can be red or black. I think they'd look really nice with an apple green lining or like an aubergine, a royal purple lining. So, you know, the sky's the limit. You're just limited by your own creativity. You can use whichever scraps of yarn you like or try to come up with any look you like. This is just a pretty standard mouse here. Adorable though he is, he's not really breaking any barriers with his color composition, and you're free to do that. So I've got 5 stitches. I'm going to knit, and I left enough of a tail so that I can sew it to the gray. So this row is knit. My next row, it's purl. Sorry if I'm holding, see, working with these circular needles, it's fight. I want to hold them up so that the wire isn't in the way, but and when I squish it down, I've got this torque, and it's like they're fighting against me. They want to fly where they shouldn't be. So sorry if I didn't. So that's just 2 rows. 1 row knit, 1 row purl, and now I'm going to knit 2 together. I'm going to knit 1, I'm going to knit 2 together, and I'm going to purl 3, and then I'm going to turn around and I am going to cast off. Okay, so I'll get my ears all sewn together and sewn on. Just, you know, I like them just at about where we end the seam here, and then I'll just give you a few tips about the face. Okay, I'll just mention that when you're sewing the inner ear to the outside, you just want to sew in the purl bumps of the gray, because you don't want your sewing to show through on the back. It's not critical if it does, it's not the end of the world, but you can avoid it by just sewing sort of on the surface of the gray and through the pink, and you'll get it on there really good. And then just weave your ends in, and see, you can't see the pink on the back, but it's all sewn in on the front here. And then I'm just going to weave in my ends. I'm just actually going to bury them in the back, in between the 2 layers. It's good enough, and I'll take that through one more time. Okay, so just as you're sewing, just stay on the surface of the gray, if you can, so that you don't see the pink on the back. And I'm just going to sew this right on here, okay? And I'm going to finish my other ear, and I'll meet up with you. Okay, so I've got my ears sewn on, and I'll just say a word about the eyes. You can use little button eyes. You can use those little safety eyes you have if you're making it for a child. I don't know. I prefer just to sew the face on and keep it simple. But whatever you're doing, same with the ears, make sure you put them on, you know, super secure if they're for a child. Go back and forth many times. Weave your ends in at least 3 times up and down and back so that they can't come undone. And use whatever the safest kind of eyes you think are. I think that sewing them on is the easiest. Now I've got this bump here, and I think it's because I didn't pull in my end when I was sewing it up. I don't think I pulled it tight enough, so I'm just going to try to shove that down a bit. It doesn't really matter. So anyway, I'm doing a duplicate stitch for the eyes, and that is just a question. You come in from the bottom of the stitch that you want. So I'm going to actually start a bit lower, and I'll tie this end in later. I'll bury it later. So I'm coming in from the bottom of the stitch I want. Then I go across the stitch above, across both legs of the stitch above, and then I come down, and then I'm going to go right across to the sort of partner to this one, and that is here, I think. You want to keep it nice and loose. You don't want it to be all tight and pulled too tightly. So I go across the stitch above. Actually, I think I'm down too low here. I think I'm down one too low. I'm going to go up one. Just hope this works. See, again, the difference between a pointy needle. I use a pointy needle for sewing things on is really good. But when you're sewing like around stitches, when you're just trying to sew using the actual stitches, a dull needle is much better. And then I come back down into the same place. And then I'm just gonna I'm gonna come out because I'll show you that how it looks. And then I'm just gonna weave these ends on the inside between the two layers. So you just pull it gently, and then you got your eyes. And so now I'm gonna go in. And I'm just going to weave it sort of through the gray, and then I'm going to pull it out really gently because I don't want to pull on my eyes. I'm actually going to go in and make them nice and loose. And then I'm going to go into the very same spot and go across in between the two layers again, kind of catching some yarn while I'm at it. And then I'm going to come through here. I'm going to cut it there. And I'm going to pull it a little bit tighter than I want to. So that's disappeared. So that's a duplicate stitch. And then for the nose, I just did a sort of a big triangle, same sort of concept, come in from the bottom up and across. And then I just did a loop, like a figure 8 through the back of the nose, and then just sewed on a couple of little teeth. So we'll meet up in just a second when I'm all done, and that'll be that. And here we are with our finished mouse slippers with their little sewn on faces. I hope you've enjoyed this knit along for these comfy lined slippers, and come join us again for more knitting techniques, all learned through the magic of and fun of making slippers. Okay, see you soon.